My name is Emma Collins, and for 3 years I lived in a mansion just beyond the oak-lined roads of Charleston, South Carolina. The house sat on a rise overlooking the river, its white columns gleaming under the southern sun like polished ivory. To anyone passing by, it looked like the picture of success and American dream framed in marble and glass. Inside, though, those pillars felt like bars of a golden cage. I used to walk the long hallway at night, listening to the echo of my own footsteps, wondering when silence had become my only friend. When I met Richard Whitmore, I thought I was stepping into a love story. He was the kind of man people turned to watch, tall, confident, his shirts always pressed, his smile quick and sure.
He said he was in international trade, dealing with antiques and rare art between London,
Paris, and several American collectors. His world sounded sophisticated and his money seemed endless. When he invited me to dinner at the Belmont Club, I was a junior interior designer barely making rent in a tiny apartment above a bakery. He ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly salary and talked about opportunities as if he could buy them by the dozen. I remember thinking, this man could build me a world. He did build one, only it wasn't the kind I imagined. After our wedding in Savannah, we moved into the Charleston mansion. It was already furnished with imported chandeliers from Vienna and tapestries from Florence. Richard said everything had a story, but he never wanted to tell the stories behind them. Just enjoy it, he'd say, slipping his gold cufflinks into place. We're the luckiest people in America, and I tried to believe him. I decorated rooms that no one ever used, hosted parties for people I barely knew, and smiled for photographs that later appeared in glossy magazines beside headlines like The Whitmores, Charleston's golden couple. But behind every smile there was tension I couldn't name. Richard's phone calls grew secretive. He spoke in numbers, codes, and foreign names, people from Zurich, Antwerp, Marseille. When I asked, he'd laugh. You wouldn't understand, darling. It's all business. I told myself not to worry. After all, we had everything. 2 cars, a yacht named Celeste, and vacations in New York City and Naples, Florida. Yet every luxury felt heavier than the last, as if the mansion were built not on land but on shifting sand. The first real crack appeared one afternoon in early spring. We were at a doctor's office, sterile and quiet, when the physician explained gently that I might never conceive. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Richard didn't speak on the drive home. That night he slept in the guest room, and by morning he had left for a business trip. It lasted 3 weeks. When he returned, he treated me like an employee who had failed a task. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by something cold, practical, and cruel. Our dinners turned into negotiations. He'd criticize how I managed the staff or the house expenses. Do you realize how much it costs to keep this place running? He snapped one evening, tossing a folder of receipts onto the marble table. I nodded, but inside I wanted to shout that I hadn't asked for any of it, that I'd trade every chandelier for a little kindness. But silence had become my habit, a kind of self-protection. Still, something inside me refused to wither. I began noticing things, small details Richard assumed I was too naive to see. A ledger left open on his desk showing payments to clients in Luxembourg. Phone calls at midnight where he switched from English to French mid-sentence. A visit from a man with a British accent who carried a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Once I overheard them in the study, words like shipment, verification, and customs route. When I entered, they stopped talking. Richard smiled thinly and said, "Emma, sweetheart, bring us some coffee, will you?" That night, curiosity won over fear. I unlocked his study drawer using a key I'd seen him hide behind a picture frame. Inside were documents, bills of lading, contracts, and handwritten notes. One phrase repeated often, European Antiques Private Channel. My pulse raced. I didn't understand everything, but one thing was clear. Richard's wealth didn't come from honest trade. I copied what I could, letters, account numbers, photographs, and hid them in a small brown envelope between the pages of an old gardening book in my closet. I didn't know yet what I'd do with them, but I knew I needed proof. For the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. Richard must have sensed the shift in me. He grew suspicious, controlling. He'd demand to know where I went, who I spoke to. Once, when I met my friend Grace Donovan for lunch, he accused me of plotting against him. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. "Don't forget who feeds you." I stared at him and said quietly, "You don't feed me, Richard. You cage me." His hand twitched as if he might strike me, but he didn't. He just laughed a slow, bitter sound and walked away. From that day, I began preparing for an ending. I didn't know what form it would take, only that it was coming. Grace, who worked as a lawyer in Atlanta, encouraged me to protect myself. "Emma," she said, "if anything happens, keep evidence. Men like him only understand power." Her words gave me courage. Months passed and Richard's temper worsened. He stopped pretending to love me in public. At charity events, he'd make jokes about my delicate condition, implying I wasn't a real woman because I couldn't give him a child. The laughter of others burned like acid. I learned to smile through it, my palms sweating under the tablecloth. Behind closed doors, I avoided him entirely, spending evenings in the library, or walking along the river where no one could hear me cry. Then, one evening, a courier delivered a thick envelope addressed to Richard. He wasn't home, so I left it on his desk. Later, curiosity pulled me back. The seal was already broken. Inside were bank statements showing transfers to an account in Geneva under a false name, his false name. My stomach dropped. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars moved through shell companies and fake art sales. I realized then that my husband wasn't just corrupt, he was a criminal. I spent that night staring out the window, watching the moon reflect on the dark water. The air smelled of magnolia and salt, and I thought of all the women who had stayed silent before me. I didn't want to be one of them. I wanted the truth to matter, even if it cost me everything. The next morning I packed a small suitcase and the brown envelope. I didn't run away. I went to Grace. Together we organized the evidence. Every signature and transaction lined up like bullets waiting to fire. She told me to stay calm, to wait until the right moment. "When he makes his move," she said, "you'll make yours." That moment would come soon in a courtroom full of strangers, under the glare of cameras, when Richard Whitmore tried to destroy me to protect himself. But on that quiet morning in Charleston, standing beside the river, I made a promise to myself. I would not break. The house that once caged me would one day stand as proof of what I survived. And though I didn't know it yet, the small envelope hidden in my hands would become the key to everything, the end of his empire, and the beginning of my freedom. The morning of the hearing, Charleston was wrapped in the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes the air heavy. Even at 9 o'clock, the courthouse steps shimmered in the sunlight, the white stone blinding against the blue sky. I wore a simple navy dress and low heels. No jewelry, no makeup beyond what was necessary to hide the sleepless nights. Grace had advised me to look calm, respectable, untouched by luxury. "You're not fighting for wealth, Emma," she had said. "You're fighting for truth." Inside, the marble floors of the Charleston County Courthouse echoed beneath my steps. The crowd was larger than I expected. Reporters lined the hallway, whispering, holding cameras, their lenses gleaming like watchful eyes. Society loved stories like mine. A millionaire husband, a broken marriage, whispers of betrayal. To them, I was just another tragic headline. To me, this was the day my voice would finally matter. Richard was already there, standing beside his attorney, Jonathan Halley, a man whose sharp suits and colder heart made him famous among the city's elite. Richard looked immaculate, as always. His navy suit was tailored perfectly, his tie knotted with precision. He turned as I entered, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That smile used to charm me. Now it only reminded me how easily he could lie. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The case was supposed to be simple. At least, that was how Richard had planned it. He wanted to annul our marriage under a clause in our prenuptial agreement. If I was proven infertile, he could end our marriage with no financial obligation. It was a cruel loophole, buried in legal jargon I had been too naive to question when I signed it. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "This woman deceived me. She concealed her inability to bear children before our marriage. Under the terms of our agreement, I am entitled to an annulment and retain all property and assets." Gasps rippled through the room. He didn't just say I was infertile. He said it publicly, as if it were a stain on my character. I felt the sting of humiliation rise in my throat, but I kept my expression steady. I could see reporters scribbling furiously, capturing every word. My Lara Grace leaned closer and whispered, "Stay calm. He's about to hand you his own rope." The judge nodded for me to respond. I stood slowly, feeling every eye on me. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I have nothing to hide." My husband, however, does. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a plain brown envelope sealed with my initials. EC, I placed it on the table and slid it toward the clerk. Richard's confident expression flickered for a moment. "What is this?" he asked. "Evidence," I said, my voice steady. "Proof that the wealth Mr. Whitmore claims as his own was obtained through illegal activity, smuggling, money laundering, and fraud. The same fortune he's trying to use against me." The clerk handed the envelope to the judge. As he opened it, a hush fell over the courtroom. Inside were copies of bank records, shipping manifests, coded letters, and photographs, every piece of evidence Grace and I had gathered. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading slowly. I saw his eyebrows rise as he examined the documents. The air grew thick with tension. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone even but sharp, "are you aware of these transactions?" Richard laughed, but his voice trembled.
Your Honor, this is absurd. My wife is clearly confused.
"She's trying to fabricate." "Enough," the judge interrupted. "These accounts correspond with flagged international transactions under investigation by federal authorities. You are hereby ordered to remain in the state pending further inquiry." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporters stopped writing. I turned toward Richard. His face had gone pale, the confident lines of his expression melting into panic. For the first time in our marriage, I saw fear, real fear, in his eyes. Grace placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder.
He's finished, she whispered, but it wasn't victory I felt.
It was something deeper, colder, the weight of truth finally set free. Richard tried to recover, raising his voice. "This woman is vengeful. She's been unstable since we married. She stole those records." "Actually," Grace said, standing, "they were obtained legally. The documents were part of household files Mr. Whitmore left unsecured. My client merely preserved them." The judge turned his gaze back to Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you speak carefully. You are facing serious allegations." The next hour blurred into a mix of voices, motions, and legal language. Richard's attorney demanded recesses, objected, argued. But every objection seemed weaker than the last. The documents told their own story, a story of greed, deceit, and crime woven through bank accounts in Zurich, Geneva, and Berlin. Grace presented everything with calm precision, letting the evidence crush his defense piece by piece. At one point, I looked around the courtroom. The spectators' faces showed a mix of shock and curiosity. Some pitied me. Others admired me. The reporters' pens moved again, slower this time, as if they were unsure how to capture what they were witnessing. When the hearing adjourned, the judge announced that the matter would be referred to federal investigators for immediate action. Richard stood frozen. His lawyer whispered something urgent, but Richard didn't move. He just stared at me, his expression twisted in disbelief. I met his gaze and said quietly, "You called me sterile, Richard. But you're the one who's barren of truth, of decency, of conscience." He didn't reply. Two marshals approached him as the judge exited the room. The murmurs began again, louder now, filling the air like a storm breaking. Cameras flashed as I gathered my papers and stood. Grace helped me out of the courtroom, shielding me from the crowd. Outside, the sun was still shining, but it felt different now, lighter, cleaner. Reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you know about the crimes? Are you filing for divorce? How did you find the evidence?" I didn't answer any of them. I just kept walking down the courthouse steps, the sound of my heels steady against the stone. For the first time in years, I wasn't trembling. Grace opened the car door for me and smiled. "You did it," she said. "You told the truth." I nodded, staring out at the people still gathered on the courthouse lawn. "I didn't do it for revenge," I said softly. "I did it so I could finally breathe." As we drove away, I glanced back at the courthouse through the rear window. Richard was standing at the top of the steps, surrounded by officers, his perfect suit wrinkled, his face pale and drawn. For all his millions, all his power, he looked small, a man cornered by his own lies. That night, I sat by my window and watched the city lights shimmer on the water. The courtroom replayed in my mind, his words, my silence, the moment the envelope was opened. It all felt distant, like a memory already turning into history. But one thought stayed with me. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through the sound of paper sliding across a wooden table. And in that whisper, I found my freedom. The months after that day in court passed like a slow storm, loud in the beginning, then long stretches of silence filled with waiting. The media called it the Whitmore scandal, as if it were some kind of television drama instead of my life unraveling in public. My face appeared on magazine covers, my name spoken by anchors on national news. Everyone wanted to know who I was, the woman who exposed a millionaire. But none of them knew the truth of those nights, the sleepless hours, the whispers of fear, the hollow echo of an empty house that still smelled like him. The investigation took over everything. The FBI and financial crime units swept through Richard's companies like locusts. They raided his offices in Charleston and New York, seized his computers, and froze his accounts. Agents found what I had only guessed at: offshore bank accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Isle of Man. They discovered coded shipping routes through Belgium and Berlin, used to smuggle rare art, jewelry, and sometimes even banned artifacts. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about corruption, greed, and betrayal on a scale I could barely comprehend. I was called to testify more than once. Each time I walked into the courthouse with my head high, though my stomach turned in knots. I told them everything: the shipments, the forged invoices, the coded emails, and the phone calls that always ended when I entered the room. They asked about his temper, his threats, and his attempts to control every part. Richard, meanwhile, remained behind bars while his lawyers tried every trick in the book. They claimed the documents were fabricated, that I had conspired with his rivals, that I was a bitter wife seeking revenge, but the evidence was undeniable. The investigators found dozens of accounts under fake company names, each one a thread leading back to him. They even recovered emails between Richard and an art dealer in Brussels, negotiating prices for stolen antiques disguised as restoration pieces. When the trial finally began, it felt like a reckoning. The courtroom was packed every day: reporters, business rivals, former friends who had once toasted to his success. The same men who used to shake his hand now whispered behind him, careful not to be caught on camera. Grace sat beside me through every hearing, her presence a calm anchor in a sea of chaos. She had become more than my lawyer. She was my friend, my lifeline. Richard entered the courtroom each day in a dark suit, his hands cuffed, his charm gone. He looked older, thinner, his arrogance stripped away by the weight of reality. Sometimes I caught him looking at me, not with love, not even with hatred, but with confusion, as if he couldn't believe that I, the woman he once controlled so easily, had undone him. I didn't return his gaze. There was nothing left to say. The prosecution laid everything bare. They traced his empire like a map of greed: illegal shipments routed through European ports, cash laundered through shell companies, and antique dealers bribed to stay silent. Each new revelation tightened the noose around him. Witnesses testified one after another: former employees, partners, even his accountant. Some cried, others lied until they couldn't anymore. The defense tried to paint me as an accomplice, claiming I must have known about his crimes. I'll never forget the day one of Richard's lawyers asked, "Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying you lived in luxury without ever questioning where the money came from?" I looked straight at him and said, "I questioned it every day." But questions can be dangerous when you live with a man who thinks he owns the world. The courtroom was silent for several seconds after that. Even the judge paused before continuing. The trial dragged on for months. The public devoured every headline, every new revelation. But behind the spectacle, I lived quietly. I stayed in a small rental house on the outskirts of Savannah, away from reporters, away from the mansion that had become a crime scene. Grace would visit often with updates. She'd sit across from me with folders of documents, her eyes tired but kind. One evening she brought news that would end it all. "The jury's ready," she said softly. My heart pounded as we drove back to Charleston. The city looked the same: the cobblestone streets, the old oak trees, But I was not the same woman who had once walked those streets on Richard's arm. Inside the courthouse, the air felt charged. The jury filed in, and the foreman stood. I held my breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Whitmore, guilty on all counts. The words hit me like a wave I didn't see coming. Guilty. All counts. My fingers trembled. Across the room, Richard's face went blank. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. The judge spoke next, his voice calm but final. Mr. Whitmore, your crimes represent a betrayal not only of your wife but of the country that allowed you to build your fortune. You used deception to destroy lives. For that, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole for the first 15. The gavel struck once, echoing through the room. It was over. Richard turned toward me as the officers approached. For a second, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. He just stared, his eyes hollow, his lips pressed into a thin line. They led him away, handcuffed, the man who once believed he was untouchable. When I stepped outside, the sky was gray, and the wind from the harbor was cool against my skin. Reporters swarmed, shouting my name, flashing cameras, asking how it felt to see justice served. I didn't answer. I just kept walking until I reached the car. Grace followed, her heels clicking softly behind me. In the quiet of the car, she looked at me and smiled gently. "You did it, Emma," she said. "You've taken your life back." I stared out the window, watching the courthouse shrink in the distance. "No," I said softly. "I didn't take it back. I built a new one. That night I returned to the river, the same one I used to walk beside when I felt trapped." The water shimmered in the moonlight, peaceful and endless. I thought of everything I'd lost, but also everything I'd gained. Freedom, truth, and a kind of strength I never knew I had. Richard had fallen like a king stripped of his crown, not by enemies but by his own arrogance. And I, the woman he once called weak, had been the one to bring him down. As the wind carried the scent of salt through the air, I whispered to the darkness, "It's over," and for the first time in years I truly believed it. It was nearly 6 months after the verdict when I returned to Charleston. The city looked unchanged, the same cobblestone streets, the same elegant houses with their iron balconies and flowering vines. But to me, everything felt different. I wasn't the woman who had once lived behind those white columns, hiding from her husband's temper and pretending her life was perfect. I was someone new now, someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side with scars that gleamed instead of bled. The mansion stood silent when I arrived. A "for sale" sign leaned against the gate, its paint faded from the coastal wind. For a moment I just stared at it. That house had once felt like the center of my world, a place of glittering parties, polished lies, and empty laughter. Now it was nothing more than a monument to a man who thought he could build an empire out of deceit. Inside, everything smelled of dust and memory. The marble floors still shone, though no one had walked them in months. Sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating the grand staircase that once made me feel so small. I ran my hand along the railing and thought of all the times I'd climbed those steps with a heart full of fear. In the end, the court had seized most of Richard's wealth. Everything tied to his criminal enterprises, the accounts, the art, the imported antiques was confiscated and sold to repay victims of his schemes. But not everything he owned was dirty. A few properties, acquired before the crimes began, were deemed legitimate. The judge awarded them to me as restitution, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, but one that gave me closure. Among those properties was the mansion itself, though I had no intention of keeping it. It wasn't home anymore. It was a graveyard for the version of myself that used to exist, quiet, obedient, afraid. So, after walking through it one last time, I met with an agent and signed the papers to sell it. The house sold quickly, for $4.5 million, to a developer who planned to turn it into a boutique hotel. As I handed over the keys, I felt a strange sense of peace. Let someone else fill those rooms with laughter. Let someone else make new memories there. Mine were finished. I left Charleston soon after and moved north to Portland, Maine, a city far removed from the glittering southern elite I had once known. My new home was a modest white cottage by the sea, the kind of place where mornings smelled of salt and coffee, and the only sound was the call of gulls over the harbor. I bought it in cash, no lawyers, no contracts with hidden clauses, no shared ownership. For the first time in my life, the deed bore only one name, Emma Collins. At first, I didn't know what to do with my freedom. For so long, my life had revolved around surviving, reacting, enduring. But slowly, a new rhythm formed. I woke early to watch the sunrise. I learned to cook for myself, and I took long walks along the docks where fishermen hauled in their morning catch. I discovered that peace wasn't quiet, it was steady. It was knowing that no one could take your breath away unless you gave it to them. But I couldn't forget the women I'd met during the trial, the wives and girlfriends of men like Richard, who whispered their stories in court hallways and bathroom mirrors. Some had been threatened, others silenced by fear or money. I saw myself in them, versions of Emma Collins still trapped behind locked doors. That realization planted an idea that wouldn't let me rest. I spoke to Grace about it one evening over tea. What if, I said slowly, I created something, a foundation, maybe, to help women like that? The ones who can't afford lawyers or don't know where to go. Grace's eyes softened. You mean help them fight back? I nodded. Exactly. Give them what I didn't have, until it was almost too late. That conversation became the beginning of the Whitmore Trust. I chose the name deliberately, not to honor Richard, but to redefine it. The name that once symbolized greed would now stand for justice. I invested a portion of the money I'd earned from the house sale and worked with Grace to establish the foundation legally. Within months, it became a small but growing organization that provided legal aid, counseling, and emergency housing for women escaping abusive marriages or financial manipulation. We started with just 2 rooms rented above a bakery on Commercial Street. The first woman we helped was named Lavra Bennett, a mother of 2 from Ohio, who had fled her husband after years